Okay, theoretically we're starting soon, so what are we missing? Oh, here we are. Hello, testing, testing. Hopefully people can hear us. Check me out. All right, well, I'm assuming that we're good, so let's go. Hi, everybody. I'm Keith Baker.
I'm Dan Garrison. Together we are the designers of Phoenix Dawn Command.
And we're here to talk about running Phoenix Dawn Command. Last week we talked about playing and what it's like to play the game and sort of strategies for players. Now we want to talk more about the marshals and what it's like creating a story, things that might help you as you're running games, and other things you might want to do with the system.
And one thing I just wanted to start with, to people who are just trying being marshals, the game masters of Phoenix for the first time, is one nice resource you have is that there's the mission sequence that comes in the Marshal's Guide already. So not only is that an entire campaign that you can run pretty much right out of the book, it also, each of those missions contains building blocks of different scenarios, combat scenes, social scenes that if you just want to remix those, you can create a lot of content just off of that as well. So
yeah, I'm just speaking to that for a moment. So again, the game comes with 7 missions that are ready to run right out of the book with all the challenges and such part of the deck that you get when you get the game. We expect that to take 7 to 9 sessions of play. 2 of the missions are pretty long. But as Dan says, we really did try with those to have really pretty much 6 very different sorts of scenarios. So it's not that you're doing the same sort of thing. You know, in one you're basically constantly on the run, in one you're actually dealing with a siege, in one you're trying to extract someone from a dangerous situation. So it is exactly that of, even if you decide not to run those, certainly take a look at them and sort of consider how you can use those different styles of play. And the other thing is there's also quite a lot of setting information that comes out in the adventures. So it's definitely worth sort of reading through them, whatever you do, just to get that flavor.
but that said, if you're like me when you GM, it's probably very difficult for you to just run a mission right out of the book exactly as it is, and you're thinking about how you want to run your own adventures. So what we want to talk about tonight is what makes an adventure a Phoenix adventure, how is it different from other role-playing games, and what sort of things should you be thinking about as you design your own adventures.
So one thing also to that note is we are working on expansion possibilities. So you have in Phoenix around 30 or 40 challenges sort of in the initial deck. You can use those however you want to use them, but we will be providing new challenges, and you can, of course, make your own, and we'll talk more about that later. But starting with that basic question, what makes a Phoenix story different from other types, adventures you might run in other systems? And one of the very fundamental things, is the fact that the players aren't necessarily going to live through it. And part of this is, with a Phoenix adventure, you want the stakes to be really high. You want the odds to, the players to feel that if they triumph, they're beating the odds. That, this is a difficult challenge, and that if they pull it off, they've accomplished something significant. In part, because there's not much point in having a game where, death is a cool and exciting event, if, in fact, you don't expect the players to potentially die. But
right, and I think that's something to think about as you design Phoenix missions, is sort of think about what are the opportunities to die here. So most often it'll be combat, but ask yourself: does this combat have opportunities where a phoenix's death could push things forward? So, in other words, sometimes there's a ritual where a phoenix has to sacrifice themselves. That's something that, when done in the middle of combat, can both really be exciting, but it can also seem like a real risk to the phoenixes. And I think that's an interesting story choice for them to make. There could also be situations where think about whether or not the phoenixes, how close they are to an area, since an area is their respawn point, right? So if they're having an adventure out in the wilderness and you've already established that it's 7 days out from the nearest area, you may essentially cause the party to split, unintentionally. Excuse me.
Well, I think
unless there are a couple lessons that can kind of get the wing back together, but it creates a different set of stakes. It may be that if everyone dies, there's really no chance of taking back whatever it is you were sent on the mission for. Whereas sometimes it's totally fine to have a death if for example, the phoenixes are defending an area, so they're right there, and it's almost on.
So I think, sort of stepping back for a moment, to me that first most important thing is the question of what's at stake. What are the players fighting for and potentially dying for? And Phoenix, you generally don't want it just to be like, oh, we're going into a place to find some treasure. Who cares? Is that really, something? Even though death isn't the end, it's a limited resource, and just being like, oh, I fell down a pit and I died, but I guess I'm coming back. That doesn't feel exciting. Now, if it's a matter of, well, you're going into this place to find a artifact that is the only, holds the secret to stopping the Bone Army, or something like that, you can still have, it's a treasure hunt.
Right.
But why does this matter? Why is this so incredibly important that, if you don't get this thing, something terrible is going to happen? Tied to that, because death isn't the end, quite often you want time to be a factor. So sort of a classic example is to say you're in a village and there's a chant outbreak. And essentially, if it's just started, if you can stop this in the next hour, then you can contain it, you can hold it in, and that's great. And if you can't, by the time you come back, you won't be dead, but whatever city it is that you were in, we will now have lost. And so you're sort of setting right there, and the players know it. Your success in this mission basically is, the lives of 4,000 people are resting on whether you can succeed here. And again, death isn't the end, but the players know that there are consequences, and those consequences will come into play. What you want to do then is already have in your mind, how will this play in the future? What is it that the Empire is losing if they lose this city? What is it that essentially they stand to gain if they can hold it in place?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the best first questions to ask when you're designing a Phoenix mission is, what are we going to lose that's worse than a bunch of Phoenixes dying? Because fundamentally, that's the trade you're asking the team to make, right? Is what's worth sending Phoenixes in for that, that the Legion can't handle, that, mortals in the Empire can't handle, that this Grimwald tribe can't handle. And so that might be mortal lives. It might be a lot of them. It may be one of them if it's someone who's important to the Phoenixes, or if your particular wing of Phoenixes just have strong views about the importance of human life. Every wing kind of interprets that question differently.
That's true.
So,
and that's part of it too. Of as you get to know your Phoenixes, one of the things we ask in character creation is, why did you come back? What are you fighting for? And so, the best adventures are the ones you're going to be creating for your wing, and you're going to know what is it these people care about. Something people will be very, very driven to protect innocence. Some people won't give a damn. this comes to, so 2 examples here. If you look to mission 2, Chants and Whispers, that is an example where you're dealing with a chant outbreak, and there are a lot of innocents that are going to die if you can't resolve the situation quickly. By contrast, you go to, I think it's mission 5, the Coratan mission. And in that, you're actually dealing with a very small group of people, but it's all using the buddy system, and it is basically the lives of these 8 people directly depend on you. And you have a secondary mission. You have something that you're trying to deal with, and that ends up being something of a bottle scenario, where essentially you get into a place, you're locked in there, and there's a whole lot of dangers, and it's, can you get out of there, first off, with what you came to find, and second off, will any of the people you're protecting survive with you?
Yeah, but that mission is interesting also because the stakes are not entirely clear in that mission.
Right.
There's actually a lot of different outcomes that Phoenixes could consider success. Either they save the lives of the expedition, or maybe they don't, but they clean it up in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they deal with the threat. Maybe they ally with the threat.
And that's another very interesting point on Phoenix, is that sometimes it's great to just have, again, the clear binary, this is victory, this isn't. Do you stop the chant, don't you stop the chant? And even in that second mission, Chants and Whispers, part of the point is you're there to get a sage out of this place. And part of the question is, do you just grab that sage and go, at which point you can technically say that was our mission and we did it, or do you actually try and save the 1,000 people who are going to die if you abandon them? And again, there's no right answer. You can say we did the important thing and we got the guy we were supposed to get.
Well, and I think that's something, at least for me, that I think is really important about creating an interesting Phoenix mission is have multiple objectives. Not necessarily make them mutually exclusive, but make them different priorities, weighted differently by different Phoenixes. And then kind of see that if the Phoenixes have to make the choice, oftentimes the choices between, can we do objective 1 and objective 2, or we can survive, and we can
Right.
and we can only pick 2 out of 3.
And a secondary aspect to me is that a big part of the story of Phoenix is the Empire is being destroyed by the Dread. And part of a typical Phoenix adventure, again, Mission 5, Pulling Strings, actually isn't typical at all, but quite often, a simple Phoenix adventure is responding to a threat. Something has come up, you are jumping in there and trying to deal with it. But at the same time, a big part of the story of the Dread is that we don't understand it. And part of that is because there's actually a whole lot of different components that are very different. The chant, the bones, the fallen. Looking to the fallen, different fallen are actually dramatically different from one another. And part of the question is, in addition to what are the challenges of the fight and what is at stake, it is what can be discovered. What is sort of the mystery here that can be revealed. And that's part of Mission 5, is first off, you're finding out more about Coratan, but second, you are dealing with some ancient spirits, and it is very much this sort of discovery of what are these things about, and then how do we feel. Essentially, if you're offered a powerful weapon, but at the cost, potentially, of innocent lives, well, at this stage of things, which is more important? And just in the process,
good arguments
stuff
for both of them. I mean,
right.
Phoenixes don't have alignment in the way that Dungeons and Dragons do. Mm-hmm. We know a little bit about what makes our Phoenixes tick because of the schools, because of how they've reacted to their previous deaths. But that said, that doesn't necessarily... I think Phoenixes can come in with many different perspectives. I mean, there are Phoenixes who say, only really special people become Phoenixes after, living a distinct, just a mortal life with distinction. And in that way, phoenixes are more important than mortals. And alternatively, some phoenixes are like, I've got 8 lives. If a mortal only has 1, of course their life is more important. So uh, deciding what a life is worth, I think, is an interesting calculation in terms of deciding what your phoenix story looks like, because it's not really laid out for your players, and they get to decide for themselves.
So a secondary aspect to this is, I mentioned at the start, you know things about your phoenixes. You know why they died, who they cared about, where they were from. And it is always better, whether you're using the existing missions or making up your own, when you can personalize those in some way to your existing group. And you don't want to do that, sort of in a way and feels too forced. You don't want it to be, hey, every person I meet is an old friend.
Yeah, I threaten every mission. We threaten a different PC sister.
Right.
You don't need to do that.
But at the same time, on one of the things that's going on is there's a web series called Saving Throw, and they are going through a campaign of Phoenix, and they're in fact creating their own adventures. You can find that on YouTube. Just look up Saving Throw Phoenix Dawn Command. And I ran the 4th adventure for them. And it was basically the case that it's going deep into the Grimwald to try and recover an Aerie. And part of the point there, Aeries are important resources. Most of them are inactive. So it's a sort of dangerous mission. They have to protect a number of innocents because it's not simply about getting there. You've got to have enough staff left to actually run this place and get it operational once you leave. And so there they had the very clear, we only have this small group of people, but even if we don't particularly care about people, if these people die, the whole mission's a wash.
Right. That's just to prevent, well, it's not just to, but I think it's one of the ways that Phoenixes prevents the proverbial party of murder hobos, where if your players decide that actually no human life has any meaning, which is stark and nihilistic, but they're allowed to feel that if they want to, they still need some mortals around just to run Aeries. Phoenixes can't do that on their own, so strategically, there's a reason you still have humans in those settings.
And in that case, part of the point is that one of the Phoenixes was from the deep Grimwald.
Yeah.
And so it was very easy for me to say, okay, there's this character here who is a scout, who's the person who's taking them to the Aerie, who's discovered it. It was very easy to say, okay, this is one of the other surviving members of your tree. And, we went into her background. Her tree had been wiped out by the Dread. It was easy to say, oh, he was a scout. He was away from the village when the attack that killed you came in.
Yeah.
I talked with her in advance of the game a little about, okay, well, tell me someone who was important to you. Give me this story. And that's important, because I didn't just start the mission and say, and here's an old friend of yours, and expect her to care. I basically, in an interlude beforehand, said, tell me about your tree. Tell me about your past and sort of people who mattered to you. And so then when I say, and here's one of them, that's already her story. And then that meant it was really dramatic, because now she's going through this not just with these people to keep alive, but one of the only members left of her tribe. And there was a great moment towards the end of the game where it's basically she's hit with an overwhelming attack and has the choice of she can save herself if she lets both the mortals, including this guy, die that she's protecting, or she can die and save him. And that's the kind of choice I love of, again, she could have done either way. There's an argument for both. But she actually, by that point, cared about this guy, because we had sort of built up the story, and as the mission had been going on, we dealt with, sort of played out some interactions and things like that. And that's just sort of the thing, is in the case of things like buddy missions, the more you can actually make the, not make the players, but help the players feel a connection to the world. They are more than just combat machines. There are still things left that matter to them.
Well, and Keith's talking about how to give those NPC interactions meaning when they first happen. Another thing I want to touch on is continue to make the Phoenix's decisions have consequences in later missions or later in your story. So what that can be is if they do save someone that they didn't have to, even if they're not strategically important, it's I loan an orphan or something, right? Have that character show some appreciation the fact that the Phoenixes went out of their way to save them, and maybe one of the Phoenixes died to do it, right? Alternatively, if the Phoenixes do kind of make some cold calculus and they do sacrifice some mortals to achieve what they consider a more important objective, kind of haunt them with it a little bit. And
have their child show up and say, "Where's my daddy?
Right.
When's he coming home?"
Well, it could be something like that. Or for that matter, if someone that trusted the Phoenixes to protect them dies, but they die in kind of an awesome way, have them come back as a Phoenix in another wing, and then have them hold a grudge against your wing, for 8 more lives. So
yeah,
7
definitely.
lives.
And that's something we talk about in the book, is the idea of the rival wing. And the point of the rival wing is just whatever you do, that's sort of happening organically. But it's also a reasonable thing sort of early in the campaign to ask the players to develop. Tell me about another Phoenix. So tell me about someone you've met working in Dawn Command, and basically build a second wing just as this sort of, well, who have you met? How do you interact with them? Do you like this person? You met another bidder. Do you get along? Do you hate each other? And that gives you a lot of tools to plant hooks in future stories. Again, well, when a scout has been lost, or when something happens, when you're creating interludes, well, here's this time where you and the other, the devoted from the other wing, were sent out to do this thing.
Right.
It's all about, the players are going to be more engaged in the story if they've helped create it. And similarly, even with Mission 5, where you get that bunch of buddies, they're not people the characters know before, unless they're from Horatan. But part of the thing is to have each player talk about their buddies. Tell me something about this person who you're protecting. Because again, the more you can get the players actually feeling like this is their story, not just something you are telling them, the more they're going to care.
Well, and we write this into the missions, where we give sort of open areas for the marshal to solicit player ideas about what the sort of non-essential details of an NPC or an environment are. And I think that's really important. Like, that's one of the ways that Phoenix, even though there's a very tactical part with the cards and the decks and so on, where it has sort of a narrative freeformness to it, and honestly, it seems like it's worked very well on playtesting. That's something that players like doing. Sometimes it takes a session for them to kind of wrap their heads around it if they're not used to a system that does something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Where they're like, wait, I thought the GM was supposed to tell me what is in the room,
And that's exactly, yeah. I mean, it's definitely a point. So one of the early adventures I ran, you're in the Grimwald, you're in an area that the spirits are disturbed, and you find this idol of the sort of protector spirit of the region. And I told the people, clearly something's wrong here. There's, corpses of animals piled around it, which certainly isn't right. Its lips have been sewn shut with vines. That's not how this is supposed to look. And there's something else that's really kind of disturbing about it. What is it? And to which the person who I asked said, "Oh, it doesn't have eyes." And I'm like, okay, I can work with that. And so I'm like, yeah, you're right, it doesn't. And so I then added in the detail that anything that was possessed by this spirit would actually claw out its eyes, which was sort of a gruesome image, but very distinctive. and it made that player feel, very much like, ooh,
Yeah, please feel free to mine your players for nightmare fuel.
I mean, it's part of the thing is that's sort of the thing, especially when you get that kind of thing. You don't know, unless you know them well, what your players actually find creepy.
Right.
And, I might be terrified by spiders, but none of my players care. And so if I'd said, ooh, it's all spiders everywhere, they'd be like, whatever.
Right, much like, earlier where we were kind of, you may not know what your players feel like is worth sacrificing themselves for. So, let them kind of fill in the details for you, or let them sort of, what are the ways that we can figure out what kind of information they care about, right? I think that's, those are two different areas where we can kind of do the same thing in terms of soliciting player feedback in a sneaky sort of way to kind of give them a better adventure from it.
Now, stepping back to some of the stuff we talked about earlier, so part of the point is deciding relationship with time, and that is both the time you expect this mission to take, but also how that interacts with Phoenix's coming back to life. So in something like Chants and Whispers, we say this is very time sensitive. You have only a couple of hours to pull this off before it all gets blown up. And you are not going to get a dawn in between that. There is no coming back. So, if you die, you're at least out for this session. And that is why we have attendant spirits, things like that. So they're not necessarily completely out. But there it is. On the other hand, you get Mission 3, Scar Tongue, where we say from the outset, we're going to have a really tough fight right at the start. But we are going to have you walking into this scene just before dawn.
Right.
And so we're going to hit you really hard, but if anyone dies, they're coming right back. So it is establishing the danger of the situation, but building that in, that they're going to have another chance. And then by contrast, later on, you get sort of the extended siege, where the mission is going to take days. And, and it's more about sort of what are your plans? How are you building this situation up? What are you doing between things, rather than the, high pressure time limit of Chants and Whispers.
Well, then yet another example in the Summer Shores mission, there's a gauntlet sequence where the Phoenixes can't really beat the enemy. They're really just trying to get through it in a way that they can kind of conserve as much of the resources as possible. And part of what gives that mission some punch is that there's no lit area in that area. So your Phoenixes, if they realize that, are going to play more conservatively, versus something where if it's just about dawn, you may burn all of your sparks or play very recklessly because you get another chance.
And that's exactly the point of Scar Tongue, is that's one where you want to call that out. You want to let people know in the fight, remember, it is actually dawn's just an hour away. You can really throw everything in, whereas conversely in something like the Summer Shore, you want them to be realizing, yeah, you're not coming back to this situation. And so just thinking about that, and that comes back to, it's the same point to going to the unlit area and the deep Grimwald. The whole point is, again, if you die, there is no way, the area is days away. You're not rejoining the mission. And establishing that in both your mind and then making sure the players understand, what is that relationship. A second thing I want to touch on is we've talked again, having reasons for the players to die, having cool things to do with death. But you also want to make sure that generally death, that sort of death, where it's baked into the mission, is something that is a choice. So the classic example is sort of having a bomb. And you have a bomb in a room full of innocents, which is essentially what happens in The Harvest. And one of you can just throw yourself on the bomb, and you will die, but everyone else is just saved. And that's just all there is to it. Or you could try to disarm it, but it's going to be really difficult, and if you fail, everybody dies. And the point there is they don't have to do it. They can try the skill route. They've got alternatives, but there is that option to just say, I don't want to take that chance. It is more important to me to be certain we get this done.
Yeah. But again, make sure they have a choice. Don't have a
Yes.
situation where there's no threat of death, and also don't have situations where the entire wing dies automatically or anything like that.
If you just say the ceiling is collapsing and will kill you all unless one of you sacrifices yourself, and there is no other way out of it, so it is just you go into the room and one of the phoenixes dies. That doesn't feel like, again, a choice or a success. That feels like the game master stuck me in a no-win situation.
It's just kind of a boring thing, and it feels like a railroad. Yeah.
So you can certainly set in Chants and Whispers at the end, if they go all the way down in terms of dealing with the chant, there is a situation where they have to burn a whole lot of sparks. And if a phoenix dies, they generate 10 bonus sparks with the death. And the point to that is, by that stage of the game, first off, it's unlikely that they'll have enough sparks to do it straight up. But second, even if they do it without anyone dying, it's going to leave them very, very thin. And so you have that, can we actually survive, if we do it this way?
Can we afford to do that? Or they might go in realizing there's no way we can do this. Oh, wait, but if one of us dies, that can make up the difference in sparks.
And the thing about that is, of course, it's not pinned on any particular person. Anyone could decide to be the person who dies. And again, that makes it a choice. Someone gets to say, I am going to do this. I'm content. I'm sacrificing myself. You'll all be stronger. And it's all back to that, making death feel like a heroic decision as opposed to a bad die roll.
Yeah. So
we've talked a lot about sort of general story, but a big secondary issue is about actually challenges themselves. When phoenixes get into dangerous situations, whether that is directly facing some kind of monster, or whether it is, again, you're in a room with the ceiling coming down and facing you. Talk about your process for creating a challenge or setting up a challenge.
Things I like to think about when we have a challenge is to have more to the challenge than just the monster or the enemy that the phoenixes are dealing with. So we have a couple of different things we can think about as we do that. One of them is that we have the environmental aspects, right? So you want to create a list of those anyway, and you're going to want, maybe 6 to 8 of those in a scene, so that way your players can kind of use the scenery around them, and some of their lessons need them. But also I like giving sort of functional things for the phoenixes to do beyond just getting that extra card. So if you think about fight scenes in a martial arts movie, for example, a lot of what makes those scenes unique is the way that the combatants don't just fight each other the way that they would in a perfect situation. What do they do if they're not allowed to use the regular weapon, or if they find something convenient in the environment around them? So ways that we can do that in Phoenix are having enemies that sometimes can't be defeated in a conventional way. And so your wing may need to be making skill spreads to sort of either figure out the way to defeat the enemy, or possibly there's things that they can do that don't involve just doing damage to something. So
looking very briefly at that saving throw mission I discussed before, basically at the end of it, the players end up fighting a Shoggoth. And what I established there is that it just gains 10 health levels every time it takes an action. And it cannot be defeated. It is this endless mass that is coming up from below. And so again, it is not about defeating the enemy. It's about we've got to figure out how to close this door. There is something in the room that is going to close this door. What is it we need to do it? At the same time, specifically with this creature, its attack value is equal to the number of health levels it has. So also, they can't just ignore it, because every round it gets much more dangerous. And so then you get this, okay, we've got to keep fighting it, but we've got to find another solution because we're never going to win
Right.
with straight combat.
And Keith, I think you're hitting on something important here, which is one thing that I think makes a good challenge is making sure that there are more options for the Phoenixes to pursue than just fighting, and also maybe more options than the Phoenixes can even pick from, right? So, uh, for intellect schools, for those Phoenixes, ask, what sort of thing would they want to know about this situation? What kind of clue can you give them that might point them in the right direction? And feel free to give them mechanical bonuses for these too, so they feel like they're getting something tangible for taking that action. So,
and that's another good example of that are the chant missions, where the point is if someone studies the chant, they can actually potentially learn, how to do a counter chant or something like that. And you don't need that to succeed, but if you pursue it, usually at personal risk, because listening too closely to the chant isn't a great thing to do, it actually does then give them a concrete new option to explore.
And then also for physical characters, the ones with strengths in their deck, make sure that they have more options than just fighting as well. So Forceful in particular can use a lot of the elements in their environment, and so make sure there's opportunities to do things with their athletic specialty. Situations where, if we could lift that heavy object to blockade the door, that would keep the bones from coming through.
Right.
Or if you could get up to the second level and then, cut the rope for the chandelier, you could do a really cool attack that way. Those are things that add a lot of richness to the scene, and they make it distinct from every other time the Phoenixes have fought, a dread enemy. But they can do it with skill spreads too.
And in general, that is something that I just, definitely feel is the case when you're creating a challenge is the base statistics are definitely important. But again, when you're working to a mission, thinking about, but where is it being encountered? What are the specific sort of challenges and such there? Looking just to the very first adventure with the harvest, part of the point there is the harvester being stronger against people who are afraid.
Right.
And so we have this mechanic of there are things that will make people afraid. It's very dangerous for them to be afraid, and the players have the choice of simply ignoring that. Or, again, a strong person can actually just get out of it by hitting the harvester, and sort of that restores their confidence. But there's this opportunity for leaders and diplomats to reassure people. Yeah. And so again, it adds you don't have to do this, but there is this option that can make things safer aside from just fighting.
One thing I wanted to mention is in missions, particularly the missions written in the book, you'll notice there are not actually that many combat scenes in each mission. There's usually 2, and sometimes maybe only 1, actually. So Phoenix is not a dungeon crawl where you have 7 different combat encounters before you get to the end room, right? So, and with that in mind, I think something that maybe is a useful perspective as you create challenges is think of every challenge for the Phoenixes as a boss battle.
Yep.
Think of something interesting about that scene, whether it's some sort of tactical ingenuity they're going to need in order to beat someone who can't be defeated in a conventional way, or make the stakes really high where the Phoenixes are worried that they're all going to die, and they really feel like they're being challenged to use their cards in the best way possible. Increase the stakes by putting mortals there that either need to be escorted out, or being held hostage, or need to be saved in one way or another, or take something that they've seen before, but kind of dial it up to 11, so they kind of have an idea what the tactics are here, but then throw a curveball at them, right? If you're dealing with a challenge and you can't think of a way to make it interesting, for example, fighting more chanters on the way towards a whisperer or a the final scene or whatever, maybe instead of having them fight another challenge, kind of abstract it, right? Just say, you're going to go through, there's 3 more floors of chanters here. maybe the wing takes some damage, depending on like a extended skill roll or skill spread, rather than we have to fight each of these chanters one by one.
And Chants and Whispers is a very good example of that. If you look at Mission 2, it's exactly that. We start with a fight so that you clearly establish this is what chanters are all about. And then we do abstract it to say, well, now you're trying to get down through this chanter-filled place. How are you managing to do that? Are you going to try and use stealth? Are you going to try and just barrel your way through? And again, that is more abstracted to, well, if you do a really crappy job, if you have a bad plan and do a crappy job, you're just going to take some damage, and we get to sort of abstract out. So how did you get hurt exactly? What happened? Oh, when you were trying to sneak and you fell through the floor into a pack of chanters, and they did some damage before you you failed them. So it's all back to that. You don't have to play out every single combat situation as a fight if it's not actually going to be challenging. And that's sort of the point of that chanter situation, is saying you're not going to face a threat you can't overcome. You just might get hurt a little in the process. Whereas the fight scenes are things that you have to make very difficult decisions on the fly and where people may die.
Yeah, I mean, Phoenixes are champions, right? I mean, these are immortal in a limited sense, but these are heroes with multiple lives that have supernatural abilities, and some things just shouldn't threaten them very much. I mean, they might take a wound or two, but really, feel free to not worry about those situations. Just let the Phoenixes decide how they took care of them, and then move on to where the Phoenixes really do have to make a choice, or something really is going to challenge them.
One thing I'll throw out in just talking about challenge design is, to me, you do have this element of, again, you want fights to be tense. I am happier having a challenge have a really high attack than a really high defense. In that basically having a frightening attack that is likely going to hurt people, that raises tension. Having a huge defense that basically my character just can't hit it at all just can lead to a sense of, well, there's really nothing I can do here, this isn't that interesting. Taking the Shoggoth example I used before, his defense was pretty high, but it was still okay, everyone's going to be able to hurt this, it just keeps coming back. But if you have something with like a 20 defense and the only person who can hit it is the elemental if he pours all his energy into it, that's not actually interesting. That's more just frustrating. Whereas having the 20 attack coming your way is generally more of a, oh my goodness, how can I actually survive this? What can I do? They have to come up with something.
Well, and as a marshal, you have a little more flexibility too, because your players don't necessarily see the entire suite of attacks that a challenge has, but they always see the defense number. So, and the health levels that are on the challenge. So, once you've decided that, you don't have a lot of flexibility to
make
fudge
it easier
so to
attack.
speak.
Yeah.
Whereas with attacks, even if an enemy has a really strong attack that's really terrifying and will kill the Phoenix if they get hit twice with it, mix it up. Have the Phoenixes get hit by it once, and then switch it up for a different kind of awful attack that's maybe easier to defend against the second action.
And that's a good point, that it is not your job to wipe out the wing. It is your job to create a tense, suspenseful story where people feel like they could all die. And you shouldn't go easy on people. I mean, you shouldn't do things that the players are going to say, well, that's just stupid. Why didn't he kill me when he had the chance? But at the same time, you can play to the, okay, I could kill the elemental right now if I made, it's easy to look at the numbers and say he doesn't have enough cards to defend if I killed him. But the bitter just hit me really hard. I think I'm going after the bitter. And so what I'm saying is think to it as a story. Is there a reason why, even though mechanically I could wipe that guy out, I'm going to do something else instead? This isn't a puzzle. It's a story, and you want to make sure that the story feels satisfying.
Yeah, you don't have to mechanically figure out what's the most direct way to eradicate the entire wing, and then that's not winning the game as the marshal. Uh, so uh,
At the same time, compared to some games, it's not the case that you particularly want to go easy. I mean, you don't want
right,
to be soft. You don't want, if you don't kill the players in some way, like any players, you're actually holding them back. But you don't need to sort of, again, systematically single out and,
yeah,
approach things.
don't dump on a single Phoenix unless they're really making decisions that you feel like they've kind of gotten a warning that, wow, if you run into the group of Chanters by yourself, you're probably going to expose yourself to a lot of attacks. So.
And I guess my point on it really is allow the players opportunities to do things that will change things. That is to say, again, we have the elemental. I could kill the elemental with a single, with one more attack. Well, I'm going to tell people that. You realize he can get wiped out if he's going to get hit there. What are you doing to draw the fire?
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily being soft on people again. It's making them feel like this is part of the story. Like he will get wiped out if we don't do something.
And often just the threat of something like that is as good as throwing that attack at the player in terms of creating suspense. Right. So,
and a great example of that is the Whisperer. The Whisperer telekinetically grabs someone. There's no defense against that. It can just do it. And that person both has reduced defense while they're being pinned, and each round they take 1 point of damage and 1 wound.
Yeah.
And so it's not a huge instant kill, but it makes them vulnerable to other things, and it sets a timer on it that everyone knows. And that's a very easy one to tell everyone. He's going to take another point of, another wound at the start of the next round. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
And so it sets a very clear, again, can the people find an answer to that problem?
Right. Don't necessarily kill all your Phoenixes all the time, but put your Phoenixes under threat of death as often as you can. And that can be showing off a strong attack that a challenge has, having something in the room or in the scene that there's kind of a timer where they know if they don't deal with this in time, things will get drastically worse or they'll all die. Having enemies that get stronger over time is another sort of timer you can put on the Phoenixes where they realize, they can think ahead. They'll see that, if we can't deal with this in 4 rounds, we're going to have twice as many of these undead guys after us, or the building's unstable. Pieces are starting to fall down around us. Like, we can't stay here. So
now, I think that does bring up just another point that is a very good general issue when you're running this game. It is a story that you are building together with the players. And one of the things is that it is generally the missions we have created are missions that will generally require teamwork for success. People are going to have to work together. People are going to have to make sacrifices. People coming from other systems or types of play may not be used to that idea. If you get the person who's used to playing the chaotic neutral thief who pickpockets other members of the party, that is not a character who works in Phoenix. And even in, someone was just talking on Facebook, in the Phoenix On Command group on Facebook, saying they got into the first mission and the Shrouded grabs the Flamekeeper and just leaves. Right. And the other players get wiped out and die. And part of it is a thing where you may need to sort of, again, just make clear to the party, by the way, these are, the level of threat they are facing, or just things like, hey, this guy's going to die if nobody helps him.
Right.
And you, as Marshal, most likely understand the system and how things work better than the players do. And so it does help to occasionally just sort of guide them a little of, well, bear in mind you could help him by doing this thing, or he's going to die if you don't help him in some way, or things like that. And you don't tell them what to do at all, but make sure you're making sure they understand their options.
Right, and in that case, I think the Marshal kind of felt like the mission was a failure, but fundamentally, if the Shrouded got the Flamekeeper out and they decided that was the most important thing, the other Phoenixes died.
Well, actually, I think the issue there was that they decided, oh, the Harvester tracked that person down and killed them too.
Oh, well.
And that was certainly a case where that I think is the only problem in that situation.
Right.
Of if it had been me running it, I would have said exactly that. Well, you did save the Flamekeeper, and Flamekeepers are a rare commodity, so that's something. That comes back to different types of victory. That's the taking the sage out of the building with the chanters, and at least calling that a victory. So certainly, yes, in that situation, I would have said, well, you've accomplished that. And then you would have had the other players being like, great, well, we died because you ran off. And, that sort of creates interesting tension amongst itself. But...
And I think that's actually something, especially since, everyone's new to playing Phoenix. Phoenix is a new system. One thing you may be thinking about is, as a marshal, how can I coach players who are used to a more traditional, fantasy tabletop RPG sort of setting, like Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, where Phoenixes don't necessarily have as straightforward niche as classes in D&D do. But at the same time, Phoenixes do need to stay together. Like, you don't really want to separate the wing with the nature of the challenges that you're up against. And you may need to remind the players that, when you trained as a wing, your marshals told you, you're much stronger together than you are if you split up. So that doesn't mean it isn't the right thing to do sometimes. And
especially if you're shrouded or forceful and scouting is your thing. But... that's one of the beauties of the ability Shrouded Bond. Is Shrouded Bond essentially lets the Phoenix sort of teleport back to other members of the wing. And that's a great thing for the person who likes sneaking ahead or sneaking around, because they can always make a quick jump back to the rest of the party. But one of the other things, again, just when dealing with players used to other types of games, another thing that comes up a lot is when a Phoenix is attacked, they play cards from their hand to defend, and they don't draw back till the end of their turn. A lot of people coming from other games will just have an instinctive reaction that if they can defend, they should defend. If they have the cards in their hand that could allow them to avoid an attack, they should. Whereas in practice, if an attack is not going to kill them, there are certainly times when it will be more fun for the player to hold onto those cards and do something big and cool with them on their turn. The player who's too obsessed about defense, first off, runs down their cards and doesn't have a lot of resources to actually do interesting things. And second, doesn't end up dying and then doesn't advance. So it hurts them sort of in two ways. But they may not understand that because they may just sort of feel like, I don't know, it's weird, I never have any cards.
And what I would say is for Phoenixes you're trying to teach that lesson to, have them watch the Bitter, because Bitter gets it about twice as fast as every other Phoenix, that they have to take some wounds to be effective.
Right.
Because mechanically they get big bonuses for it. So, but once other people see that, I can take a few hits and still survive, and then I can do way more on my turn, like, people get jealous of Bitter's awesome turns on the first couple missions, and that's great. That teaches people kind of what they can do with Phoenix.
And it also comes down to you want some mystery to attacks. You don't want people to know exactly what is going to happen if this thing lands an attack, unless they've dealt with it before. But you can still give people a sense of the sort of obvious potential damage. So if we are talking about a giant, colossus creature that could squash you with a single massive fist, and it's if this hits you, you're dead. There's nothing wrong with saying, this looks like you better avoid it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you're dealing with a mob of chanters, you can certainly establish these guys are strong, but they're still just strong people. They will hurt you, but they aren't going to kill you. Basically, you can take this attack and not die. Just
what
so
I
they
might
understand
do is not say, hey, these can only inflict a maximum of 1 wound on you. But what I might say with the chanters is, they're possessed humans, but they don't have any weapons. They're just going to claw and bite at you, and so, the damage is going to be limited, versus you're going to be hit by a 2-ton fist. You figure out how much of you is going to be left in the crater, right? So
And so that's just the sort of thing is if an attack is not completely life-threatening, it doesn't hurt to, if you can tell the player is on the edge of, ooh, should I burn all my good cards to do this, to let them know, this is something you have leeway on. It's up to you. This isn't going to kill you.
Also, if you have a player who really just can't help themselves and needs to defend against everything, have them play Durant, because Durant has a combat style that lets them draw cards when they defend.
Yep.
And then it becomes an optimal strategy again.
And generally, just in helping with character creation, that is sort of a point of think about what players like. The person who plays bitter is going to die a lot, and make sure that there's someone who's going to be comfortable with that. Conversely, the Durant generally will die the least. Make sure there's someone, it's a great choice for a person who is sort of not sure they like this whole death concept. We wanted to talk a little bit. We're sort of starting to get short on time. I want to talk just briefly about interludes. And interludes are just the sort of concept of what happens between missions. The missions tend to drop people out in sort of a very broad range of places. And so you manage to save the Blackstone area from the Harvester, but there's only one of you left, and he's got to get back to the area on his own. There's sort of opportunities to just do a little sort of storytelling that doesn't have to do with game mechanics or
fighting traditional challenges.
Just what happens to you between that last adventure and this adventure. If someone died, tell us about your time in the Crucible. What was that like? What was your experience with your mentor? Just basically having people think about their characters beyond just the...
And I think these are interesting areas where we can kind of explore sort of what's unique about Phoenix's world beyond just the types of things you're fighting against. So, I mean, if you think about Phoenixes, there's all sorts of questions that are brought up with, how does someone manage having multiple lives? For example, legally, is your character the same person that they were in their first life? I mean, what if your character was wanted for a whole bunch of crimes? Are they still responsible for, being brought to justice for those? If your character was actually executed in the mortal life and came back as a Phoenix, is there any sort of legacy to their, misspent youth?
And that's an excellent sort of point of that's the thing. Most missions are going to be dealing with a very clear and present threat that has to be dealt with right now. Interludes are a great time to deal with those sort of dangling hooks of their story.
Right.
That, you do get, you've been summoned to appear at Imperial Court. Are you going to ignore that? I mean, can you take time off right now to do that? Or, and I think it's that exact point of there's a lot of opportunity to dig deeper into each character's past and into the world itself that you might not have sort of in the midst of a mission.
And, I mean, with somewhat of a light touch, in the setting, we talk a little bit about, Phoenixes are kind of considered different people than the people they were as mortals, but I think we all kind of know intuitively that that's not really how it's going to play out when people's emotions are involved, what if your character was married and had a family before they died? Do you no longer have a relationship with those people? What if those people tried to move on because they thought you were dead, right? I think there's lots of sort of interesting things that we can play with where, the Empire is really a desperate place right now. The Dread has been winning for years now, and people are really pinning their hopes on Phoenixes, the people who know about Phoenixes. So is there sort of a cult of personality around Phoenixes where, Ilonan youths want to die in glorious ways so they can come back as Phoenixes and actually help beat the Dread, right? Or are Phoenixes like celebrities, with rupees? I mean, this is a society that was built around the idea that the reason why the Empire won was that Phoenixes were superior to all other kinds of, magic and warriors of these other cultures. So what does that look like when you actually consider sort of the social ramifications of those things?
It's also a way to handle when one character lags behind in number of deaths with a lot of other players. So you've got that Durant who just never dies. And you can, in an interlude, just sort of talk about, okay, well, let's come up with a way that you actually die between these two adventures. And, let's come up with something that feels like a dramatic story. I recall one session I was running where basically we wanted to have a reason for, I think it was a forceful at the time, to have a death, and I had her sent into the Summer Shore in advance of the actual Summer Shore mission, just as a sort of you're trying to get supplies, to an area there, and it was a good way to talk to her a little about the whole idea is no one's actually been behind enemy lines here. So it was sort of a cool mission for her to be sort of, oh, I'm scouting out something no one's ever seen, but it's an absolute suicide mission.
Right.
And we talked about in how do you actually end up finally dying. But that also then laid the groundwork for when we went to the actual Summer Shore mission. She already had been there and seen some of this stuff, not to that particular city, but it meant that she sort of felt like, oh yeah, I know what we're getting into. So interludes, I mean, I think the basic point here is just to say it is entirely sort of collaborative storytelling, but it's that opportunity to delve deeper into personal aspects of the character or deeper into elements of the set.
Well, and for someone who's not dying, it's kind of a way to reward them by saying you can die exactly how you want.
Yep. So last thing we wanted to talk about a little was basically other things you can do with the setting, the challenges, things like that. So you had talked a little earlier about thoughts about that.
Yeah. And I'm trying to remember.
Well, I'll switch back to mine. I mean, so one of the points is that Phoenix tells a very specific story at a very specific time. So you are the new wave of Phoenixes fighting the Dread at a time when the Dread is not understood. You can certainly explore different points of the world. You could decide to tell a story during the conquest when the Phoenixes are actually fighting, let's say that the Phoenix Legions are actually going into Scavia and fighting the Fallen who are there. And banishing the Fallen, or they're fighting the Elonians with their house gods. You could do something that I'm planning to do at a local convention, is to run a adventure set at the end of the Civil War, sort of just after Dawn Command has actually been shut down for the first time, of sort of exploring this concept of your Phoenixes in a world that really no longer has a need for Phoenixes or wants Phoenixes, with no great enemy to fight. What do you do? How do you use that power? How do you deal with the world? And the whole point is that's just going to be a very different type of story again, but it's something that sort of builds on the world and explores different aspects of it.
Yeah, and that setting in particular, I think, is very interesting because we kind of make the case in sort of the default setting of Phoenix that the Empire isn't perfect, but it's just a lot better than everyone being eradicated by the Dread. But if you play it in a different era, the Empire really could be the most, so to speak, evil thing in the setting. I mean, the Empire is decadent. The Empire is kind of in a slow obsolescence. They think that they have the superior mode of thinking, of magic, of fighting wars with the Phoenixes, and there's nothing really to challenge them anymore. So what does it look like when that power gets wasted?
Mm-hmm. And it's sort of, you can take that on both sides of the Civil War. In the front end of the Civil War, you do have what pushed people to the point of turning on the Phoenixes. Were you getting horrible excesses? Were you, what is the things that push people over? And then again, on the flip side, being the last Phoenixes in a world that really no longer wants you. And where do you go with that? And, I know some people who are playing around with using the system in a modern setting. We've considered science fiction. You can certainly take the principles and adapt it to other things. Another thing I quickly want to talk about is on creating challenges is also, so you can use the challenges we have, you can use the examples of things. We will be making more challenges in the future, but there is the point that you don't actually need a card for a challenge.
Yeah, a challenge is never owned by the player, so it's never getting stacked with other cards, and it's also never part of someone's deck. So
you can use a marker of some kind. You can just draw something on a file card, which is how we started off in the first place.
Right.
So basically, we don't want you to feel limited to just the things that we have created. Do understand you can certainly create.
And it's also okay to use an existing challenge and just ignore all of the abilities that are on the back of that card. But
Yes.
Sure, phoenixes have seen bones before, but these bones, even though they look similar, have a different strategy than the last set of bones they fought.
And that very much comes into environmental effects too. Of well, you can fight bones, but then we take the Summer Shore mission where we're like, there's just too many to fight. That's not what this is about. Likewise, that's the point of the saving throw mission where I took the Shoggoth and I basically said, okay, I'm going to use this overview of this creature to serve the purpose that I need, but I'm pulling off these aspects. I'm dropping its health levels, but I'm giving it this constant building health. So certainly, yeah, taking things and tinkering with them to fit the needs of a particular scene is an easy way to get more mileage.
And even if you're using those same missions and the same challenges, if you have a really small group or a very large group, you may want to change those abilities somewhat anyway, just because otherwise that's not going to be an effective challenge for the size of your group. It's either going to be too lethal or it's going to, go down before it gets to actions, right? So those are things where you might want to adjust the number of health levels. Defense is kind of the last thing I want to change because I always want players to feel like they can be effective at hitting things, and it's printed literally on the card.
Yeah.
But
health levels can be changed, though.
But health levels can be changed. The attacks and the strength of those attacks can certainly be changed. Speed sometimes can be changed, although speed kind of scales to the number of players who are playing anyway, so that's not as big a deal. So, and we'll talk about more of this, in the Facebook community and also on blog posts.
I was about to say, I understand there's a Phoenix designer who's working on an awesome blog post about different
there on that. Yeah, so so I will speak more about that, but I think that's something where don't feel like you have to treat a challenge as sacred. Again, we're trying to create good stories here more than we're trying to create challenges that always behave the same in every situation. So.
In any case, I think we'll wrap up there. But one thing we do want you to know is we are going to be in the near future talking about potential expansions that will be coming out for Phoenix. Both Dan and I are working on blog posts and additional material. So at the moment, I'm kind of crazy with this game Illimat that I'm going to be kickstarting October 4th. So that's making my life a little crazy for the next couple of weeks. But we definitely have a lot of plans for continuing to support and expand Phoenix, and you'll be seeing those soon. Any last words?
Just to say, but yes, if you liked Phoenix and you liked what Together Studio is doing, Illimat is by the same brain. It's another game by Keith Baker, and not mine, but I played it. It's a lot of fun. So. Very different from Phoenix, but something that I encourage you to take a look at and consider supporting as well.
Cool. Anyhow, that's it for us, and just keep an eye on the boards. Also, the Facebook group. There's a Phoenix Dawn Command group on Facebook that is being pretty active and that we're both helping out in. So if you're on Facebook, that's a great thing to check out and be a part of.
Yep.
All right. Thanks everyone for taking part.
Thank you. Have a good night.